Weihnachtsvorabend in einem Lazarett.
Stand Leonidas mit 300 Spartiaten aus einem Stamm, der wegen seiner Tapferkeit und Kühnheit bekannt war. Und eine überwältigende Mehrheit griff immer wieder aufs Neue an. Bei der Zahl der Pfeile, die abgeschossen wurden. Aber die 300 Männer wichen und wankten nicht. Sie kämpften und kämpften einen aussichtslosen Kampf. Aussichtslos, aber nicht in seiner Bedeutung. Und dann fiel der letzte Mann. Und in diesem Engpass, da steht nun ein Satz. Wanderer, kommst du nach Sparta, so berichte, du habest uns hier liegen sehen, wie das Gesetz es befahl. Es waren 300 Männer, meine Kameraden. Und heute gilt dieser Kampf dort, dieses Opfer dort, noch so heroisch, so als Beispiel höchsten Soldatentums. Und es wird auch einmal heißen, kommst du nach Deutschland, so berichte, du habest uns in Stalingrad liegen sehen, wie das Gesetz, das heißt, das Gesetz der Sicherheit unseres Volkes es befohlen hat, das Gesetz für Deutschland zu sterben, wenn das Leben Deutschland diese Forderung an euch stellt.
It was the bloodiest battle of the Second World War, a battle that came to define the war in the East, and the rivalry between two of history's most brutal dictators. But how did the battle for Stalingrad, an industrial city on the banks of the Volga, come to play such a defining role in the course of the Second World War? With the help of a team of experts, each taking the perspective of a figure involved and using previously unpublished archive material, we'll uncover the key moments and decisions that led to the deaths of nearly 2 million people and paved the way for Stalin's ultimate victory over Hitler and the Nazis. By spring 1941, Hitler's armies occupied huge areas of Western Europe. France, Belgium, Holland had all fallen in quick succession to a series of lightning blitzkrieg campaigns. Just 2 years before, in 1939, Hitler had surprised the West by signing a non-aggression pact with Stalin's Soviet Union. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact served as the basis for German-Soviet cooperation and opened the door to the carving up of Poland between the dictators. It also gave Stalin a free hand in Eastern Europe, whilst ensuring Hitler's eastern borders remained secure. But in the summer of 1941, Hitler shocked Stalin and the world by launching his biggest invasion to date. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia.
Hitler's not totally unrealistic, even though he has a very blinkered idea of what's going on. He looks at the Red Army and he knows that it's very big, but Hitler also has a lot of faith in the fact that, the German army and the German armed forces are disciplined and ruthless and better mechanized and better equipped, and ultimately have Hitler on their side. Look, Hitler is fat-headed enough, frankly, to regard the Germans as more likely to win because Hitler, is in charge. That's the level of arrogance you're dealing with Hitler.
This lightning-fast invasion came as a total shock for Stalin.
Stalin is a bit like a rabbit in headlights. He's completely wrong-footed by what's happened. You know, he's refused to accept the intelligence picture. He can't believe that Hitler would do this. He's just not mentally, psychologically prepared for it. And at the time, he's in his dacha in Konsevo. He's out of it. He's been on drinking bouts. You know, he's just not on it at all. But really quickly, he snaps himself back into form.
Catching his former ally off guard, Hitler's armies made rapid progress, encircling and capturing huge numbers of Soviet prisoners, whilst overrunning the capitals of Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia. The speed at which the German army was able to advance was not just a result of its technological superiority, but also of Stalin's distrust of his own armed forces. This distrust had culminated in the purges of the 1930s and had left the Soviets perilously short of experienced soldiers and leaders.
The Red Army is still in a case of transition. There's been the purges in the late 1930s, where they under Stalin's direct orders, 23,000 Red Army officers are executed. 3 out of 5 marshals, 13 out of 15 army commanders, which is one of the reasons why the Germans initially have these overwhelming successes.
Sich die Infanterie vorwärts und dringt immer tiefer in das Geschützwerk ein.
But not all of Barbarossa's objectives were met. Fierce Soviet resistance and the oncoming Russian winter meant both Leningrad and Moscow remained out of German reach. With the end of the year in sight, Hitler was forced to put his armies on a defensive footing in preparation for the following year's campaigns.
Diese Soldaten sind in zahllosen harten Kämpfen erprobt.
By the beginning of 1942, Hitler is in a slightly mixed mood, if you like. He had intended, when he launched Barbarossa in the summer of 1941, to have got to Moscow before the winter and been triumphant. Of course, that was utterly delusional. And make no mistake, the German armed forces and their Axis allies had a really tough winter on the Eastern Front. But what's giving Hitler hope is the fact that they've survived that winter. So actually, by about the spring of 1942, Hitler's mood is pretty punchy.
The question about just how apprehensive Stalin really is about matters in the Soviet Union in early 1942 has been much debated. A lot of people think he was still staring down the barrel, that the Soviet ultimate victory was far from assured, etc., etc. However, there's a really interesting thing, and that is in December 1941, with German forces at the gates of Moscow, the snow coming down, it all looking absolutely bleak. This is sort of one of the greatest moments of Soviet peril. Anthony Eden, the British Foreign Secretary, comes over on a mission to Moscow. And one of his chief diplomats is Sir Frank Roberts. And Sir Frank Roberts talked about how they went in for their first meeting with Stalin. And Stalin's first point was, right, let's talk about the post-war border settlement. That's not someone who thinks he's about to be defeated.
Joseph Stalin, born in Georgia in 1878, had risen through the ranks of the Communist Party to become the de facto leader of the Soviet Union, ruling over a total population of nearly 200 million people.
Stalin is a truly fascinating character. Obviously, he starts his life, his young adult life, as a murdering thief, revolutionary, but develops into this incredibly clear-headed, cold-hearted, extremely effective autocrat. Politically, tactically, he's a very, very intelligent man. He's a man who also is totally devoid of any compassion, any empathy whatsoever. He is utterly, utterly cold-hearted, but brilliantly evil.
By the outbreak of the Second World War, Hitler, who had come to power as Chancellor of Germany in 1933, now led his country as the Führer of the German Reich.
Hitler was a very complicated personality, but Hitler does have his strengths. He is single-minded and determined. His whole internal monologue is saying to himself, no matter how bad things get, I, Adolf Hitler, have the willpower that will always be triumphant.
The two tyrants now found themselves in a battle for survival, a battle that would call upon the full extent of their ruthless talents.
I think Stalin's strengths are his single-mindedness, his absolute focus. I mean, one has to remember that Stalin absolutely, totally, to his very core, believes in Bolshevism. He absolutely believes that the capitalist states will fold in on themselves. He thinks they will crumble. He thinks that ultimately Bolshevism, communist state, will win. People's lives, people's feelings, they are totally irrelevant when it comes to getting in the way of that goal. Totally.
Hardened veterans of wars and political struggles, it would be their weaknesses as much as their strengths that would decide the course of the war.
Hitler's weaknesses as a leader was his inability to form a coherent structure below him. What he does is to have competing agencies and personalities that are all performing very similar tasks. So the whole legend of German efficiency is completely dismantled by Hitler and the Third Reich, because everything's basically a bit of a mishmash and a disaster below him. Also, Hitler associates bad news with what we're today called fake news. Whenever he hears something pessimistic, whenever he hears a kind of bleak assessment, he refuses to believe that it's true. And this is a real problem when he's prosecuting a battle. A good leader will organize a retreat. Why? You're saving your men for tomorrow's battle.
Stalin's weaknesses chime with a lot of autocrats. That you believe your own genius, you believe your own rightness. And there are a number of moments in the war where you can see that hubris, his own belief in something, has got in the way of common sense. You see this at the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, where all the intelligence is telling him that the Germans are about to invade, and he refuses to believe it. And yet it's there, absolutely clear as day. But the interesting thing about Stalin is he learns from those mistakes. And as a war leader, he just gets better and better. And that's a sharp contrast with Hitler.
Despite being sworn ideological enemies, each tyrant recognized in the other the talents that had taken him to the summit of absolute power.
While Hitler really despises communism and regards it as a threat to the world, and don't forget, there are people in the Allied nations who regard communism in pretty similar terms. Actually, Hitler has a lot of respect for Stalin as a leader. He sees in Stalin that cunning, that power, that triumph of personality that has clawed up this young man from a very humble background to become, the ruler of the Soviet Union. And of course, Hitler recognizes a similar career trajectory.
I don't think there's any doubt at all that Stalin does respect Hitler in the late 1930s, certainly. Here's another autocrat, here's another very strong leader. Actually, their paths are not so dissimilar, although, one has to think of these kind of different ideologies, sort of National Socialism, hard right on one side, Bolshevism on the other, communism on the other, but think of them like the horns of the buffalo, so that it's not a straight line, they're kind of almost coming back and meeting again as they curve around. So they're not so dissimilar. And then they have the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and Stalin kind of believes there is mutual benefits on that, which will last more than just for the invasion of Poland. He believes this is a longer term thing, and he feels that both he and Hitler are talking the same language, which is why when Barbarossa is launched in June 1941, it is such a profound shock to Stalin.
As we enter 1942, in view of the upcoming campaign season, Hitler's military planners were acutely aware of their army's desperate need for fuel to sustain the German war machine. This need would force the German army to focus their attention on the oil-rich Soviet cities of Maykop, Grozny and Baku.
At the forefront of this offensive now then was Army Group South, and a key formation is the 6th Army, with Paulus commanding 6th Army.
Born in 1890, Friedrich Paulus joined the army at the age of 20 and served during the First World War. By the outbreak of the Second World War, he had risen to Chief of the General Staff and played a key role in the successful invasions of Western Europe.
Paulus was quite a quiet individual. He wasn't brash or arrogant. He didn't ever show a flair for frontline combat command. He was a guy that would like to stay in the background. If you look at a lot of the photographs that's taken of Hitler meeting his frontline generals, you can see Paulus in the background. But equally, he was a man who wanted to be at the center of things, and that played into the kind of character he was.
Auch hier warfen die Sowjets unseren Truppen immer neue Divisionen entgegen.
The new summer offensive would catch Stalin off guard. Stalin was expecting an offensive directly against his center again to capture Moscow. He'd arranged the bulk of his fresh forces against Army Group Center, where he thought that was going to happen. And obviously, German intelligence was feeding the Russians this mirage of troop maneuvers to make him believe that. But the real offensive was obviously going to be in southern Russia to capture the oil.
The assault on southern Russia would be split between two German army groups, Army Group A and Army Group B. Army Group A would head south towards the lower Don to take Rostov, to thrust against Stalingrad, and deeper into the vast oil fields of the Caucasus. Army Group B would strike towards the middle Don River opposite Voronezh.
I think privately, some of Hitler's generals realised that they've bitten off more than they can chew. But, you know, Hitler is thinking, if I can get down to the Caucasus, if I can get those oil fields down there, then actually I'm in really good shape.
For Paulus, this was an opportunity to demonstrate not just his abilities as a planner, but also in the field as a leader.
From a personal point of view, I think he's very happy that his career so far has brought him to the zenith of being the commander of such an elite crack formation, which is what it was. It had led the successful offensives previously against Poland and France, etc. And he's got some of the cream divisions under his command. He's got very talented commanders under his command as well. He's a major player in this major offensive. So what's not to like about that is that he's thinking, all eyes are on me. But as a planner and a strategist, he was skeptical to a degree on how successful this new offensive could be, because like all senior German army commanders, going all the way up to Hitler's supreme headquarters, there were many people who saw the length of the country that they were going to capture in this fresh offensive. It stretched for hundreds, a couple of thousand kilometers if they got all the way down to the bottom of the Caucasus. So he's not stupid. He knows that this is a big task, but equally, he's believing the intelligence that's being fed to him from Supreme Headquarters that Hitler was believing, as in the Red Army was ripe for destruction. So this offensive would be the one that would finally crack the Red Army and destroy them in the field.
By the start of 1942, over 1 million Soviet troops had been killed, with another 3 million taken prisoner. These huge losses, twinned with the speed of the German advance, led Hitler to believe that the Soviets were finished. What Hitler didn't know was that Stalin's forces were far from depleted. It was under this misconception that Hitler ordered the attack towards Stalingrad and the wider offensive in southern Russia.
He might have doubts, but he's still going to obey the command structure. He's still going to obey what his goals are. And
At the end of the day, he knows he is leading one of the crack formations of the German army, the Sixth Army. It's succeeded every single time it's had to. He's leading it now, he's got to deliver. And he wants to obviously please his commander and his supreme commander, Adolf Hitler.
Hitler's path was set, and Stalingrad lay firmly in it.
There's two cities that are named after the great heroes of the revolution. There's Leningrad, of course, formerly St. Petersburg, and then there's Stalingrad. And Stalingrad, unlike Leningrad, is effectively a new town. This is part of the Soviet urbanization of the late 1920s and early 1930s. It's a town of factories. There's the great tractor factory there. There's the Red October steel works. This is a big industrial city on the River Volga. Now, in the big scheme of things, in terms of great, big, important Soviet cities, Stalingrad is not in the kind of top tier. But in terms of a city that has to be defended at all costs, of course it's in the top tier because it's called Stalingrad.
Previously Tsaritsyn, it was renamed Stalingrad in 1925 to honor Stalin's role in the defense of the city during the Civil War. As with nearly all Soviet cities, it had been put on a war footing, with its factories refit to produce military equipment. Up until now, the city had avoided the worst of the war, and life for the local population largely went on as normal. That population now found itself under the gaze of Hitler and his armies.
It was a big target for the Germans, but the trouble was the city hugged the Volga like a ribbon. So instead of being a kind of a city like London, I suppose, or Moscow, it's not just this big homogeneous, huge, sprawling city. It's a very long city. It's over 20 miles long and it's hugging the river. And that just brings lots of geographical problems for any military commander thinking, I need to take this city. His front's hugely much more extended, therefore he needs more troops, he needs more armoured formations. And Paulus knows this, he's a strategist, he's thinking, do I have enough forces to take this huge, sprawling city in front of me?
But Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union wasn't just motivated by the need for oil. Driven by his hatred for Bolshevism and his theories of racial superiority, the war in the East was envisioned as a war of annihilation.
German invasion of the Soviet Union is an ideological war. It is a war of annihilation. That's absolutely clear from the moment that the Germans go in and all the planning that Hitler's doing.
Hitler's ultimate aim on the Eastern Front is to overrun Moscow, hang Stalin in a public square, defeat communism by doing all that, and in doing so, giving himself lots of living space, Lebensraum, for the greater Third Reich. I think in the spring, summer of 1942, I think he still has the broad support for what he's doing militarily from the German people. They think, wars never go according to plan. You're not going to win every battle, but we're going in the right direction. There are, a lot of people dying, but at the same time, there's no retreat.
Stalin's response to that is to respond in kind. And what you find in any war is violence begets violence. So the more outrageous you are, the more violent, the worse it gets. It just spirals into kind of ever worse violence. It is a question of who's going to blink first to a certain extent, but Stalin knows he's got the resources to be able to see this out. This doesn't mean to say he's clear of any defeats. That's not necessarily the case. That's not clear. But ultimately, will he win? Will the Soviet Union be triumphant? I don't think he has any doubts about that whatsoever. And he doesn't care how ruthless, how barbaric, how many people are killed to achieve that ultimate victory.
On the 28th of July, Stalin issued Order number 227, his infamous "not one step back" order. Red Army soldiers were expected to fight until the bitter end. Anyone caught retreating would be shot. Paulus and his troops would soon feel the sharp end of renewed Soviet resistance.
He was feeling confident at the start of the campaign because fundamentally, they still ruled the skies above him. So everything that he'd done, every advance that the Sixth Army had made, Army Group B that the Sixth Army was part of had made as they pushed their way to the east, even though they were coming under intense counterattacks by the Red Army, every attack the Red Army had put up in front of them, in some cases suicidal tank attacks as well, had been decimated by the Luftwaffe. They'd shot the Red Army Air Force out of the skies during the offensive, and they pretty much had carte blanche to what they wanted to do in terms of where their next move was, moving towards Stalingrad, moving towards the Volga. So for a combat commander on the ground, if you're ruling the skies above what you're doing, they were basically bombing or paving the way for his motorized divisions to push forward. At the time he was thinking, I still think I can roll them up and capture the city.
Hitler sees Stalingrad, in his path on the way down to the Caucasus and all that lovely oil. And initially he issues a directive number 41, in which he says, go round Stalingrad, encircle it, destroy any Russian units in the vicinity, but keep making your way down. That's the first plan. But then he issues directive number 45, in which he says, actually, the city should be taken. Now, that is a huge change in policy.
He thinks I can have it all. We can't capture the huge mass of Russian troops that we did the year before because they're not there. His racial, ideological hatred of the communists made him think they are destroyed. They haven't got any fresh troops, they haven't got any fresh armoured formations. So he makes the fatal mistake of splitting the army in two.
What Hitler does is that he massively ties one arm behind his army's back by making a series of totally inept decisions. Hitler's worldview is ultimately all about the survival of the fittest. So he has this really odd sense of different people being superior to other people. Well, actually, it's not the fittest who win battles. It's those with the best tactics and the best kit, and those who use the kit in the best way.
Paulus finds himself, well, I've got less troops, less armoured formations, less cover from the Luftwaffe. I've now still got to capture this city, get to the Volga with what I've got. So in the back of his mind, this gnawing fear is getting bigger and bigger and bigger as he's losing troops, as he's forcing his way further east, and he's coming under more resistance from the Red Army. Because he doesn't know, but Stalin's issued not one step back, Order 227. It's we stand and fight.
Despite Stalin's order that his troops were to hold every inch, Paulus and the Sixth Army continued to make good progress in their advance towards the Volga. On the 23rd of August, the 16th Panzer Division broke through to the Volga and reached the outer suburbs of Stalingrad.
German troops reached the Volga on the 23rd of August, and that is a shock because it's just north of Stalingrad and suddenly Stalingrad is threatened. And he is determined that Stalingrad should not fall, that it should be fought for every yard. 2 days later, on the 25th of August, he insists that Stalingrad be given siege status. And what that means is all the population there, and it's already swollen by refugees, is to be brought into militias. They've got to help build barricades. Every man, woman and child and all the rest of it has got to kind of help. So absolutely there is a very, very stark response to the arrival of Paulus's troops at the edge of the Volga.
Hitler's main strength has been concentrated here, but the Russians have fought for every yard.
In preparation for the Sixth Army's arrival, Goering's Luftwaffe began their indiscriminate bombing campaign of the city. In a matter of hours, 600 German bombers turned the city into a wasteland. Faced with this onslaught, Stalin turned to the only man who had shown he could halt Hitler's armies.
The Germans have taken the Crimea, they're pushing into south towards the Caucasus. There's still a huge threat towards Moscow from Stalin's perspective. Who does he make Deputy Supreme Commander? Zhukov. And that's because he knows that in a tight situation, this guy is going to be tough, clear thinking, and he's going to be equally ruthless with his manpower as Stalin wants him to be. So in other words, he's a kind of chip off the old block in other words.
Zhukov is ruthless and he's tactical, and importantly, he's organised. When you are bringing together so many different military elements, you have to know absolutely everything about what everyone does and where they need to be, and Zhukov did this.
Born in Western Russia in 1896, Georgy Zhukov had risen through the ranks of the Soviet army to become one of Stalin's most trusted generals.
We know that Zhukov had many meetings with Stalin, and we know that they knew each other well as colleagues and professionals. It was said that when he entered a room, he could read Stalin's mood by how he was holding or smoking his pipe. Sometimes he would argue, sometimes he would be sent out of the room. Sometimes he was even sent to really undesirable postings as a result of his arguments with Stalin.
Zhukov is able to tread a very, very fine line and not kind of pushing the insolence, not pushing back too hard against Stalin, but equally not being a pushover either, and standing up to Stalin.
The fact that he wasn't fired or tortured or even beheaded, I think shows that Stalin really valued what he had to say when he caught him at the right time.
Working underneath Stalin must be absolutely terrifying. It requires people who are extremely courageous to do it. But people also believe in the cause as well and are slavishly devoted to him. But the closer you get to Stalin, the more dangerous your life is. And no one is safe under Stalin.
It's in Hitler's order to occupy Stalingrad that we see the first signs of skepticism emerging in his senior military ranks.
The Chief of Staff, Halder, when he looks at this directive that says actually, start fighting in Stalingrad, tried to take the city, he just thinks it's crazy. He thinks it's nuts. And his fellow top brass feel the same. And anybody who dares voice any criticism is ultimately sacked. Hitler's big problem is that he's not only a politician and a statesman and the Führer, but he also thinks that as the commander-in-chief of all these forces, that actually he is the ultimate field marshal. Now, he thinks he knows about prosecuting wars. He doesn't. He doesn't know anything about them. He was a corporal. That's as much as it got in the First World War. And so his mistake is to believe that actually he's got the strategic and tactical nous to prosecute a war. He doesn't delegate. He meddles. And it's that meddling that's going to really, frankly, screw things up for him.
Stalin, in a way, does exactly the opposite. He learns to delegate more. He learns his lessons from Kiev. He is prepared to get the right people in the right post and listen to them. Now, that doesn't mean to say that he's not the total boss man. He absolutely is, and let no one forget it. But he is prepared to bring people up. And Zhukov is obviously one of them. Rokossovsky is another star. Chukov is another.
Having served under Stalin for a number of years, Zhukov was acutely aware of the threat that hung over him. Despite this, he was able to build something of a rapport with the dictator.
Stalin and Zhukov have somewhat of a strange relationship. They had a lot of meetings together, they really got to know each other, they respected each other. But before Stalingrad, Stalin had a real grasp of his soldiers and the military actions. He was dictating absolutely everything. And Zhukov did argue back, but they still respected each other. They worked through that where others may have lost their head.
The culture that Hitler creates is kind of in the rule book in bad leadership. I think Hitler got lucky initially. Poland, the Low Countries, France. In many ways, the opposing side sort of kind of lost those campaigns as much as Hitler won them. So Hitler believed in his own military genius. And so when things start to go badly, Hitler thinks, well, look, that's because they're not listening to me. I'm this military genius.
But it's in the city of Stalingrad itself, among the ruins of homes and factories, that the most savage hand-to-hand fighting has been taking place.
From now on, Paulus's forces would be battling Soviet defenders for every inch of the city as they edged towards the center.
That's where the real intensity and violence and destruction for the city was at its highest.
The sniper's name is Anatol Chekhov. In a moment, you'll see him make his 41st kill.
That's where Paulus tried every single maneuver to capture the whole city. The Germans were in the driving seat. They were seen as being in the driving seat. Their propaganda was telling the German people and anyone else who was looking that the city was being captured, street by street, house by house.
Here's an interesting film comparison. First, the German film of Hitler's troops penetrating into the factory district, street fighting, each man for himself, and all for the glory of the Führer.
The fighting in around Stalingrad, once it has been decided that the Soviets are simply not going to give in, they're not going to give an inch, how do you fight this? Because the Germans at this point have got a massive advantage in terms of artillery and in terms of air power at the Stalingrad front. So when Vasily Chukov takes over on the 30th of September, he decides, okay, well, I need to negate that artillery advantage. I need to negate that advantage in air power. And the way to do that is to fight incredibly close.
And this, Russian newsreel pictures already shown in Britain of the Soviet defender. Down in the street, a storming party undertakes the job of clearing the enemy out of a house they turned into a strong point. Hand to hand. Kill or be killed.
So guerrilla warfare is something that was really difficult for both the Germans and the Russians. It's something that is still difficult for militaries to contend with today, and particularly to organise and respond to. But the Russians really did have a strategic advantage here because they knew their city. The Germans had been fighting with a blitzkrieg style before the invasion of Russia, and that just was not possible in Stalingrad.
Vicious fighting continued throughout September and into October as Paulus's troops advanced deeper into the ruins of the city. Aided by the destruction caused by the Luftwaffe, Soviet defenders concealed themselves in bomb craters, damaged apartment blocks, and factories, exhausting and menacing the German invaders at every turn, in a type of warfare that became known as the War of the Rats, or Rattenkrieg.
The fighting then descends into kind of sort of rats in cellar stuff. On one side of the street you've got Germans, on the other side you've got Russians. On one floor of the building you've got Germans, on another floor you've got Soviet troops. And one of the interesting things about a lot of the war, a lot of it isn't upfront and personal. Quite often you don't see the people that you're fighting against. It's fought at kind of quite often at quite a considerable distance. Not in Stalingrad. This is absolute cheek by jowl, quarter by quarter. And no quarter is given in this fighting. It's incredibly brutal.
In spite of this, Paulus's forces were able to confine the Soviet defenders to a small area of the city, a thin stretch of land alongside the Volga.
So by the end of October going into November and the bitter Russian winters starting to hit, temperatures are dropping. Paulus's forces are in charge of probably 90 to 95% of the city. And where the Soviet defenders are hanging on, they're hanging on by their fingernails. It's not strength in depth. They've probably got about 100 to 150 meters of depth on little pockets of the city with their backs to the Volga. But they're hanging on. And while they're hanging on, it means the German troops still have to fight them, and it keeps them tied down in the city. And they keep having to put more and more reinforcements into this meat grinder. It's a surprise for Paulus because he's now losing 20,000 men a week in terms of casualties, dead and wounded. And to him, that's a major surprise. And he knows he's not stupid. They can't suffer this kind of attrition and still be successful, still take a city this size, but more importantly, hold it if they take it.
This is a challenge not just for military leaders, but for ordinary soldiers because it was a completely different style of fighting. So during Stalingrad we saw guerrilla warfare emerging. This is the most ruthless kind of fighting in a modern war.
Stalingrad's defenders have accounted for many of the dead, killing Germans a dozen at a time, or often enough, one by one.
The suicidal defense put up by the Soviet defenders caught Paulus's forces off guard, and with his supply lines massively overstretched, the entire offensive was brought to a standstill. In contrast to the worsening reality of the situation, Hitler insisted that the attack was going as planned.
Hitler is incredibly optimistic at the beginning of the campaign to take Stalingrad. He is telling the German people, I've basically got it in my pocket. It's sorted. No problems here at all. Yeah, it's going to be a little bit messy, but basically it's job done. He is radiating that confidence, and he's got it within him. He basically thinks it's there, it's in the bag.
Paulus is under enormous pressure because on the one hand, he's getting reports from his frontline commanders, the ones that are leading the divisions and the corps that are trying to take Stalingrad, about the resistance that the enemy's putting up and the losses that they're suffering. Equally above him, going all the way up to Supreme Headquarters where Adolf Hitler is, all eyes are on him because they want to capture this city. It means it's the key to unlocking whether the offensive will be successful or not that year. So he's got all these pressures above and below him, and he realises he's still got to deliver.
Intense fighting continued as Paulus's troops tried to break down the last remaining pockets of Soviet resistance. Drawn deeper into the heart of the city, Paulus was acutely aware of the vulnerable position he was now in, and repeatedly expressed his concerns to those above him.
I think it's fair to say that Hitler doesn't take bad news very well. I think when things start going badly in Stalingrad, and he keeps on being told that, we can't, penetrate into the city, we keep on getting held up, he just doesn't listen to it. He does not believe it. And he's like this kind of petulant kid who just basically snaps at anybody who tells him this. And on one occasion, when he hears a particularly bad piece of news, he literally just walks out the room and disappears into his quarters.
On the 8th of November, at a gathering of senior party members, Hitler informed those attending of the good progress that had been made by the troops in Stalingrad. In spite of Paulus's growing concerns, Hitler was convinced victory was imminent. Meanwhile, Zhukov had travelled to Moscow to meet with Stalin.
Zhukov is quite often going back to Moscow to see Stalin in person. They're also kind of communicating every single day. There is no sense at all that Stalin is out of the loop. And that's because, of course, what Stalin and Zhukov are hatching is a monumental counterattack.
And this is Operation Uranus.
In part 2,
he just thinks that whatever decisions he makes, because he's a demigod, ultimately, then that's always going to be the right decision. He is infallible.
Zhukov knew that the Russian armed forces had an advantage here in Stalingrad.
Well, within 3 days, Soviet forces had achieved the impossible. They'd surrounded the 6th Army.
The more precarious Paulus's situation is, the more entrenched Hitler becomes that there can be no turning round.